This video is sponsored by Warby Parker.
God creates dinosaurs. God destroys dinosaurs. God creates man. Man destroys God. Man creates dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs eat man.
Taking an idea that does exist and running with it, you have come up with one scary book.
I wouldn't worry about it.
This story has a lot to say about how we would like very, very much to play God and create things that perhaps we were not meant to create.
How can we stand in the light of discovery and not act?
Genetic power is the most awesome force the planet's ever seen, but you wield it like a kid that's found his dad's gun.
I began to realize that it might indeed be possible to bring extinct animals back to life.
Jurassic Park started out as a novel. Well, kind of. The original Jurassic Park was written by author Michael Crichton, and it started out as a screenplay about cloning a pterodactyl, which Crichton started experimenting with in 1981.
The book actually began when my wife and I were waiting for our first child, and we were decorating the nursery, and I began to buy stuffed dinosaurs. I actually bought a lot of them, and it kind of couldn't stop, and eventually she began to say, what are all these dinosaurs and why is this happening? And the whole question of children and dinosaurs began to preoccupy me, and I started the book.
First drafted in 1983, but he ended up not really liking it. It had the same basic theme of dinosaurs being brought back with the wonders of modern science, but his story would eventually expand into the idea of a theme park setting. It was, in a sense, similar to his other story, Westworld, that he had written and directed about an interactive amusement park that contained not dinosaurs, but androids.
Crichton's first directorial task is Westworld, an action-adventure film for which he wrote the script. Those who can afford it go to Westworld, a giant amusement complex for adults, where for a mere $1,000 a day, they can live out their fantasy.
I don't think the premise is far-fetched at all. In fact, whether or not anybody will actually build a resort like Westworld, exactly like with robots and stuff, is more a question. It's not a question of technology, because the technology is essentially there.
A trademark of a Michael Crichton story is that the more complex a society becomes, the greater is the danger of something going wrong.
Cut the robot power. Power cut. Shut down. Shut it all down.
Please shut down the system.
But he had some trouble this go-around with an amusement park about dinosaurs, saying that the explanations for this weren't plausible, and those who read his work absolutely hated it. I got angry reactions, such as, why would you write a book like this? But when I asked them to explain exactly why they hated it, they couldn't put their finger on anything in particular. They just hated it. That's all. Hated every bit of it.
Very often early drafts don't have that effect. They're unpersuasive, and so there's a sort of effort of trying to, I think, to shore up the argument, to make it seem more convincing. And the ways to do that are different in different books, but it's an effort is the answer.
He would write draft after draft with similar results from those he trusted to give him feedback on his work. But after some time trying to figure the story out, the author would go through a bout of serious depression for a few years.
I always feel that I'm up against the wall with somebody who's just not as good as I want that person to be, and that's me.
His close friend and agent, Michael Ovitz, the CAA's agency co-founder, would help to protect the author from a lot of attention during that time period. Michael Ovitz is an intriguing character in the story, often remembered as one of Hollywood's most ruthless agents, who aggressively went after the clients he wanted, and making a lot of enemies along the way. Creating the agency in 1975, he helped to shape a new era in Hollywood.
20 years ago, an industry phenomenon was formed by a band of renegade agents from the bowels of the formidable William Morris Agency. They managed to construct an entertainment edifice of gigantic proportions, which has changed the way that Hollywood does business. As a result, they have come to represent most of the top talent in Hollywood.
But Ovitz is also remembered for, in a sense, faking many of his relationships with clients over the years, something he readily admits to.
Also talked about the mistakes you've made. You say this, you always wanted to make clients think they're your friends, but remember, they are not your friends, they're your clients, and in the end, the clients were loyal and the friends betrayed you. And you name the friends who betrayed you, but people could say you also did your fair share of betraying too.
I think that's fair.
But despite his pragmatic viewpoint in an industry full of backstabbing, Ovitz had a unique relationship with Crichton. Michael was a client of mine starting in the late 70s. We developed an extraordinarily close personal relationship that went way beyond our professional relationship. I literally talked to him every day of the week. I did that not because he was a client, partially because he was a friend, but mostly because he was one of the smartest and most interesting people. This friendship would play a large role in the creation of Jurassic Park, but during this time in the late 80s. It was a difficult period for Crichton, as the first two films he worked on after signing with Ovitz, Agency, fell flat, which played into what some of the narratives in the industry were about him, that nobody believed he could drive a hit film. Despite the struggle, Ovitz would stick by him through this rough period. I called every day to try to get him up and moving, and I visited him often. When offers came in for him to direct or rewrite a script, I had our agent say he was busy on an original. Now, it must be noted here that Crichton himself never spoke of going through this period of depression. That narrative is primarily from Ovitz. But with that being said, Crichton was a self-described workaholic and even admitted that 2 of his previous wives prompted him to seek psychotherapy, something he would stay committed to, along with meditation and seeking out psychics and enlightenment gurus, something he talks about in his book Travels, which came out in 1988. Ovitz had become a close friend of Crichton over the years after reading his book The Andromeda Strain, and knew from his many discussions over the years with the author that he would eventually find his footing. A pillar of CAA's philosophy was that we told our clients the truth. That didn't mean that we told everyone else the truth. One of our best cover-up jobs was convincing the town for 2 years that Michael was hard at work when he was actually curled up in a ball. We didn't get caught on this kind of smokescreen because it hardly served the client we were protecting to throw us under the bus. But Ovitz's patience with his friend would eventually pay off, with something beyond what he could have ever expected. Through years' worth of redrafts, Crichton had worked to make the science more convincing, changed the perspective from that of a child to an adult, and reworked the story from a screenplay into a novel. Unexpectedly one day, Ovitz would get a call from Crichton. I want to tell you about an idea I've been working on. What followed from this phone call was a flurry of activity for the author whose depression had begun to dissipate as his project began to pick up its pace. As he told Ovitz that, I can have the manuscript done in 6 months. After putting off writing as long as possible, he went at it 18 hours a day, 7 days a week until he was done. He banged out Jurassic Park in a fury. It was like he'd been in hibernation, amassing energy for his signature work. Ovitz would recall.
It's really a solitary occupation. And there's also something antisocial about writing.
Leonardo had the idea that small rooms concentrate the mind. And I've always found that, if we rent a house someplace, I will always go to the smallest room.
It was here in 1989 where Crichton had reached the turning point, abandoning his screenplay for Jurassic Park and turning it into a novel. Ovitz would finally get to read the novel he had hoped one day Crichton might bring to him, and he immediately realized he had a hit on his hands. I think it's the best thing you've ever written. This story opened up a window of opportunity for Ovitz, the chance to bag a really big client for CAA. Almost immediately after turning it in, the film rights were offered up by Ovitz, and 4 major studio offers came in, each bidding for the rights in exchange for $1.5 million, with their own directors and production companies attached. Columbia with Richard Donner, Warner Brothers with Tim Burton, Fox with Joe Dante. But they weren't the only ones interested in the rights.
The helmet sort of brought us into the 20th century in that
I could speak to everyone. Of course, they couldn't speak back to me, so this was a director's dream come true.
James Cameron was just coming off the release of his groundbreaking film, The Abyss, in 1989, and based on the use of the then cutting-edge CGI water tentacle he had worked with ILM to create, and his past work with creature effects and aliens, Cameron was a natural fit for this kind of film, though unlike the sort of family-friendly film audiences came to know. Cameron said his would have gone further, nastier, much nastier.
I got sent the book. I got to the scene where the Tyrannosaurus Rex licks the windshield with the kids inside. Right. I said, I gotta make this movie. I never even finished the book.
James Cameron was just hours away from making his own bid, when another director would swoop in and seal the deal just before he got to make his pitch. Cameron later reflected on this and said, "When I saw the film, I realized that I was not the right person to make the film. He was, because he made a dinosaur movie for kids, and mine would have been aliens with dinosaurs, and that wouldn't have been fair."
So I would have made an R-rated, scare the crap out of you movie, and you made it just scary enough.
While Ovitz and Crichton had offered up the film rights and heard offers from various studios and directors, they really only had their eyes on one director. And this was also an opportunity to not only get a renowned director to direct the film, but also get him to sign on with the agency at the same time. A win for Crichton, who favored Spielberg, and a win for Ovitz to seduce Spielberg into signing with CAA. Spielberg notoriously did not have an agent at the time. And this is the part of the story that gets a bit complicated. You see, we have several differing perspectives on how this deal went down. First, we have, of course, both Spielberg and Crichton, whose stories have not always stayed consistent over the years over the early development of the movie. Generally, the narrative events for Spielberg and Crichton was that Crichton had already committed to Spielberg in principle after sharing his work with the director while they were working on ER, and Spielberg loved it, and Crichton said he would give it to Spielberg if you guarantee me that you'll direct the picture. But despite Crichton not wanting a bidding war, the agency would send it out to multiple studios, and while on vacation, Crichton would make it very clear that while he was open-minded, he was still set on Spielberg directing. I knew it was going to be a very difficult picture to make. Steven is arguably the most experienced and most successful director of these kinds of movies, and he's really terrific at running the technology, rather than letting the technology run him. And from these two are generally the most often told stories. But our third perspective, and a somewhat recent one, is from Ovitz, whose past we dug into a bit earlier on in this video. But I want to take a second here to explain the controversy of Ovitz a bit more, and why for this video, I decided to tell his version of events. Ovitz is someone who initially valued secrecy around his work, telling the Los Angeles Times in 1989 that if we could convince you not to do this article, that would make us the happiest guys in town. His clients and those who knew him would often refuse to comment on stories about him, though this media coverage, it would seem, would get to his head as his career and mythology soldiered on, leading to betrayal, a short-lived presidency at Disney, and many controversial statements. While the question of Ovitz's morals and interesting relationship with the truth, while he was an agent, cannot be dismissed. I find the story intriguing not because of Ovitz himself, but because of the position Ovitz was in as an agent. Creatives don't really want to publicize much about the deal-making process. Most of the time, that's just the dirty work to get done before moving on to what you really want to talk about, which is what you're making and how you did it. Also, there was not much of a reason for Spielberg or Crichton to really mention his role in this early development, because Ovitz liked his secrecy, and there would not be a reason for either Spielberg or Crichton to mention him later on, given the various controversies Ovitz brought upon himself. So his story stands out as the one person in this party of three who cared deeply about the actual deal making, even if he is an unreliable narrator. Something we noticed after reading his account from his memoirs, which deny that the bidding war happened and mentioned writer David Koepp joining the project immediately when he did not. As always, one should take a lot of the stories surrounding historic productions with a grain of salt, and enjoy the reality that sometimes the myths and stories around the making of the movie can be just as good as the one in the actual movie. Is his recounting akin to a fisherman's tale? Well, at least he had a fish to show for it in the end. Steven was the one director Michael and I knew who possessed both the technique and the sense of wonder to pull the plot off. Playing favorites on this one would alienate a lot of our other filmmakers. but it was worth it. This was a risky move that could make the other directors who were clients of CAA upset. Ovitz would fend off the directors who kept calling about the film, saying, "Michael Crichton feels very strongly that only Steven can pull it off. If that doesn't work out, I will absolutely get you a meeting." The dilemma with all of this was that they were trying to get Spielberg to agree to directing an unfinanced film with an unpublished novel and no studio greenlight. To instill urgency, I asked Steven to read the book in one evening. He called at 6 the next morning and said, "I love this story, I'll do it."
I made a fool of myself. I fell all over myself to make this movie in front of Michael. Doing everything but getting down on my knees and begging him, because I loved the idea of, DNA and dinosaurs in many combinations.
Ovitz would have to call up Universal, given Spielberg's close ties to them, and since CAA owned all of the rights to the story, they would have to work out a deal for the film. I laid out the deal, a more radical version of what we had done on Twins, a 50-50 joint venture between the studio and Michael and Steven, who'd waive their above-the-line fees up front. This would end the whirlwind week from, as Ovitz described it, typo-ridden manuscript to a fully financed film with one of the industry's top directors. And not only that, but Spielberg finally had an agent. Well, sort of. We never actually had that conversation or filled out any paperwork. I just started representing him from that point on, taking it for granted. But there was a problem. Spielberg was committed to directing another film.
This was today? Hello, my name is Dr. Thorne. I'm one of the development scientists here at InGen. I've been tasked with welcoming this year's group of interns. And if you're wondering if I drew the short straw, I did. So listen up, as I'm not repeating any of this. You should have noticed in the briefs and packets you received all of the items that you needed to acquire before you arrived. Those include your own beakers, Bunsen burners, and floppy disks to record all of your observations while you're here interning. Also, you are required at all times to wear eyewear. For almost every intern class, this seems to be the most commonly forgotten item. I can already see some of you squirming on the other side of the screen. You forgot to bring them. Yeah, not to worry. While InGen will not be paying for your early mistake as an intern, our sponsor Warby Parker can help get you the glasses you need. Alright, roll the thing. First, we must scan your face using the virtual try-on tool from the warbyparker.com or their app. After finding their pair, they will be shipped to you, and they will ensure through detailed measurements that you get the perfect fit, and for those of you that care, stylish glasses, I guess. The whole process is pretty simple. You lose a pair or two of glasses while working here. We've had a couple accidents in the lab with some of the test subjects getting loose. So you'll have to replace them from time to time, more than likely. The great news is Warby Parker glasses start at $95. They offer scratch-resistant coatings and free shipping. Now, for those of you who are watching at home, head on over right now to try on your virtual pair today and save 15% when you purchase 2 or more prescription pairs of glasses or sunglasses online or at any of their retail locations. All right, interns, let's get you out to the lab and field. We just uncovered something at our dig site. Come on.
Can't you stop these things? I'm sorry, it's kind of a ride.
1, 2, 3.
Can't do that.
In 1983, the same year Crichton started on Jurassic Park, Spielberg bought the film rights to another novel, Schindler's Ark, pledging to direct it in 10 years' time. Several projects later, that 10 years was on the horizon, and Spielberg was hesitant. Schindler's Ark was a Holocaust biography, and he had taken on the project initially, relating to it as a Jew who had experienced anti-Semitism. But he wasn't sure if he was the right person to make the film.
I wasn't really ready in my own life because I was making movies about extraterrestrials and movies about, Indiana Jones and sharks, and I was into kind of mass popular entertainment concepts, and I wasn't ready to go personal like that.
Spielberg had tried several times to pass this movie off to other directors like Roman Polanski, whose mother was killed at Auschwitz, and he himself survived the Krakow ghetto before making an escape, only to suffer even more before the war ended. Polanski would eventually refuse the offer, but would later go on to direct his own Holocaust film in The Pianist in 2003. It's actually quite fascinating and a bit disturbing at the same time that the director was offered this film, considering his decade-long court case, which involved Polanski drugging and raping a 13-year-old girl in 1977, an offense he pled guilty to on August 1977 and then fled the US upon finding out they planned to put him in prison in 1978, to which the case didn't have much movement again until 1997 and would finally be settled in 2024, ending up with him taking a photo with the person he pled guilty to assaulting. It's a truly bizarre story and one that would take a whole other video to unpack. But the reason I mention it is that Polanski at the time couldn't come back to the US. So it was interesting Spielberg would try to entrust such a personal film for him to such a director. So moving on, Spielberg, still unsure if he was the correct director to make the film, tried again to pass it off to other directors like Martin Scorsese, who was reported to be directing the film in 1988 and had already written a script for it with Steve Zalian by 1990. But the reception of his last film in 1988, The Last Temptations of Christ, was very controversial among Christianity, as it explored wide-ranging questions about faith, the true nature of love, and depicting the life of Jesus Christ in a way that drew a lot of criticism.
I'm the saint of blasphemy. Don't make any mistakes. I didn't come here to bring peace. I came to bring a sword.
The reception to that film caused him to give Schindler's List back to Spielberg, as he didn't want his complicated religious beliefs to compromise a film of that nature. Scorsese would later say, "I guarantee you, if I did it, it would not have been the hit that it became." And it was around that time, though, that Spielberg was actually wanting to get the film back. I thought Marty would do a great job with it. He wouldn't back down from truth or violence. But the minute I gave it to Marty, I missed it. I'd given away a chance to do something for my children and family about the Holocaust. The two directors would swap films, with Spielberg taking back Schindler's List and Scorsese taking Cape Fear, a project Spielberg had been developing. Feeling that there was a disturbing rise in neo-Nazism and Holocaust denial at the time, he decided to stick to his commitment and make the film, what would become Schindler's List.
I think everybody felt that we were memorializing something, and it felt to all of us as if we were shooting in a cemetery. And I received the book before I ever made the two personal movies that allowed me to make Schindler's List. The first was Color Purple, and the second was Empire of the Sun. And those, for me, were the stepping stones that gave me the courage to take on a story of the Shoah.
Spielberg would even waive his fee for making the film entirely. But Universal was nervous about this film, and they viewed it and his idea of shooting it black and white as making an already uncommercial project even more so. The studio, of course, wanted me to spell out everything, said Spielberg. I got into a lot of arguments with people saying we need that big Hollywood catharsis where Schindler falls to his knees and says, "Yes, I know what I'm doing now, I must do it," and goes full steam ahead. Universal would finally give him the green light for Schindler's List, but would give him one condition though: make Jurassic Park first. Spielberg would say that the studio knew that once I directed Schindler's, I wouldn't be able to do Jurassic Park. And that statement would prove to be fairly accurate, as Spielberg, while completing the filming of Jurassic Park and editing it before heading off to make Schindler's List, would still leave Jurassic Park's production early.
I basically called the producer, my co-producer on Jurassic, Kathy Kennedy, and I said, I gotta jump ship. I gotta make Schindler's List. And don't ask me why. And I asked George Lucas if he would supervise the dub, and George came in and dubbed the picture for me.
Still at this point in time, the agreement meant that he would be developing Schindler's List during the production of Jurassic Park, having to balance two very complex productions on polar extremes of subject matter. One a blatantly fictional family film, the other a much more grounded drama that was already a very personal film for him. So he got to work on the screenplay for Jurassic Park. To lay the groundwork, Spielberg paid Crichton $500,000 to draft the script, so he was effectively being paid to turn the story back to what it was supposed to have been in the first place. Despite the healthy financials involved, Crichton was hesitant to write the screenplay, having first envisioned Jurassic Park close to a decade ago. He was tired of its story, but that experience was a double-edged sword. He was fed up with Jurassic Park, but he also knew it better than anyone else possibly could. So he agreed, but on the condition that it would only be a draft. He wouldn't take on a full role as the film's screenwriter. For that, Spielberg would have to find someone else. That someone else was Scotch Marmo, the writer of Spielberg's previous film, Hook, who worked on the script in 1991 and 92. She ultimately decided not to build on Crichton's work and instead start from scratch, with his occasional input and the input of Spielberg. But Spielberg wasn't happy with the finished product, and so he hired another writer, David Koepp, who once again started from scratch with the input of his predecessor in Spielberg and completed the script after a few months, producing the final result that Spielberg was happy with.
What did become a struggle was trying to put out of your mind, oh my God, that's Steven Spielberg, he's actually sitting right over there, and become a collaborator instead of a fan, because the surest route to failure is to be a fan and write something that you think he would like, or that you think is in the spirit of his movies.
Despite the original narrative having been intended as a screenplay, something that Koepp said made the process of adapting the film much easier, the many years of development in the novel form meant that Crichton had expanded his story far beyond the scope of what you could plausibly fit on a cinema screen. And so for the adaptation, it was drastically cut down again, with him estimating that only around 10 to 20% of the book made it in. What I wanted to do was boil the book down and choose my 7 or 8 favorite scenes and base the script around those, Spielberg said.
And even before I had a screenplay, I began to storyboard the novel. I'd never done that before. I broke the novel down into scenes that I thought I might want to carry over into the motion picture version.
A big action scene with the T-Rex chasing the kids down a river was also left out because it felt a bit redundant and would have been expensive to film, though it did make it into the 2025 Jurassic World Rebirth movie. Hammond, who's a pretty ruthless businessman in the book, was made more sympathetic because Spielberg connected with his showmanship. The ages of Tim and Lex were swapped too, which gave Lex a crush on Dr. Grant and made her the one interested in computers instead. They also gave Grant and Dr. Sattler a bit of a romance, and his relationship with the kids started off rocky for more character development. Some characters like Ed Regis and Henry Wu were cut down or merged into other roles, and the company Biosyn was completely left out until it showed up in Jurassic World Dominion. Now that they had the story down, they had their work cut out for them. When it came to researching dinosaurs, recruiting paleontologist Jack Horner, who had actually been the inspiration for protagonist Alan Grant, to advise on the script and later the production, his research, which had also informed the original novel, encouraged Spielberg to think of the dinosaurs less as movie monsters and more as animals with real survival instincts and intelligence, where before they had been seen as lumbering and stupid. He also emphasized the relations to birds, where they had been thought of in early drafts as much closer to lizards, a very long-running stereotype, as even dinosaur itself literally means terrible lizard. And the whole design of dinosaurs is something we will get into later on in this video. But most crucially, the whole premise of reviving dinosaur DNA from preserved fossils turned out to not be plausible.
We are nowhere near ever finding a whole genome for an extinct dinosaur. Maybe in a few years, maybe down the line, we might finally get some really reliable evidence on a DNA sequence, but it'll only be a tiny, tiny smattering of that huge genome. There could be as many as 30,000 genes, and we might get a signal from a couple of them. And that certainly won't be enough to clone a dinosaur. So I think the answer to this question is it's impossible to clone a dinosaur.
They were something that doesn't exist today, and I think because it doesn't exist today, and there's no immediate direct access, it becomes the thing that mythology is made of that makes mythology so fascinating. Only it's real. It's not mythology, and I think even though it has the pull and the seduction of mythology, it also has its roots in reality.
Spielberg essentially took advantage of gaps in our knowledge to dramatize things and make Crichton's premise work, with Horner saying, basically, if I could demonstrate that something was true or not, then he would go with that. But if I had some question about it and we didn't really have much evidence about it, he would go with whatever he thought would make the best movie. And at times, Spielberg also knowingly took a dramatic license for the sake of the fear factor. But ironically, the truth surrounding these details was only discovered because of Jurassic Park itself, which sparked a new interest in paleontology. So researchers do enjoy telling the real story, but tend not to be nitpicky, actually giving Spielberg a lot of praise for the film.
Oh, I would be incredibly excited, and I thought that Sam Neill's character actually very nicely portrayed this. I would also go up to this dinosaur and listen to it breathe and feel its skin and so on, because, you know, we look just at the fossil remains, and it would be really wonderful to see an actual living dinosaur.
Now, when it came to the actors, Spielberg aimed to keep costs low, as much of the film's budget was allocated to its groundbreaking dinosaur effects. He sought talented but relatively unknown performers to avoid hefty salaries, rejecting the idea of spending millions on big-name stars. Several actors, including Kurt Russell, Richard Dreyfuss, William Hurt, Harrison Ford, and Tim Robbins were considered for the role of Alan Grant, but ultimately, Sam Neill was cast, Laura Dern secured the role of Ellie Sattler after Robin Wright and Juliette Binoche declined. Jeff Goldblum was chosen as Ian Malcolm, although Jim Carrey had also auditioned.
I didn't cast movie icon stars to play the different characters. I tried to cast really, really good actors. I thought Laura Dern was the perfect Ellie Sattler because she's such an honest actor. Sam Neill's an honest actor. Jeff Goldblum is an incredibly naturalistic actor. It seems like he's making up the dialogue as he speaks.
Richard Attenborough, initially hesitant, was convinced by Spielberg to play John Hammond. Neil, Dern, Goldblum, and Attenborough were cast late in pre-production, leaving them only a short time to prepare, with the filming schedule even adjusted to accommodate Neil. Casting for supporting roles followed a similar process. Ariana Richards landed the part of Lex Murphy due to her impressive scream test. Joseph Mazzello, who had previously been considered too young for Hook, was promised a future collaboration with Spielberg and was cast as Tim.
I always felt so much freedom with him. I always felt like I was a part of the collaborative process, you know, that it wasn't just he was telling me what to do or he was talking down to me. It was always, what do you think? And what do you think we should do for this scene? And he trusted my ideas and he let me do that. And it was that kind of relationship where I felt like a part of the gang rather than like an outsider looking in that I think brings out such great performances in children.
Samuel L. Jackson won the role of Ray Arnold after impressing both Spielberg and casting director Janet Hershenson, who had seen his work in Jungle Fever. Wayne Knight was selected as Dennis Nedry after Spielberg noticed his performance in Basic Instinct. B.D. Wong played Dr. Henry Wu, though he would be disappointed by his limited screen time compared to the novel. Cameron Thor initially auditioned for Ian Malcolm, but was instead cast as Dodgson, and producer Gerald Molen took on the minor role of Dr. Harding.
The actors certainly did their jobs and they believed who they were, and that's all an audience needs, is to believe that the characters are believing in themselves, and that's what the actors did so well.
After almost 2.5 years of pre-production, principal filming would begin on August 24th, 1992. And while the main island, Isla Nublar, would be located off of Costa Rica in the story, they would fly all the way out to the Pacific Ocean to film at the Garden Island of Kauai.
Because it takes place ostensibly on an island, we were thinking about shooting in Costa Rica. But Stephen was a little concerned about the infrastructure, that is, whether we'd have roads and whether we could get equipment there and other kinds of facilities that we would need.
They had scouted several other locations such as the Yucatan Peninsula, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Costa Rica itself. But for Costa Rica, they realized that the production would take place during rainy season, so that made it a less desirable location for many reasons. Instead, Spielberg would look for another tropical location.
So we opted for a place where he had worked before, the island of Kauai in Hawaii. And that became the exterior jungles during the day.
Had I been 26 instead of 45, I might have gone to Yucatan or the Philippines or Costa Rica. Someplace really rugged. Spielberg thought Hawaii sounded just fine, staying in a nice Hawaiian hotel with room service and a pool.
Kauai was an ideal setting for Jurassic Park, mainly because the environment itself was very, very strong visually. So it wasn't just neutral. It wasn't dinosaurs in a neutral environment, but they were emanating from something that already had a strength. Perfect type of environment where you'd want to see a dinosaur.
But beyond the allure of sipping on cocktails in a resort pool after a long day of filming, some of the locals really wanted the production to come to Kauai. Angela Tilson, who volunteered for what would eventually become the Kauai Film Commission, scoured the island for locations that matched the script and vision of the filmmakers. You get a script and, as a location person, you break it down. Then all of us went out and took pictures of what we thought. I think they just sent us a synopsis of what they wanted: jungle and dinosaur land. Perhaps in gratitude for helping the pre-production team out with location scouting, they would let her play a background character in the film. I got chosen because I'm Latin, and the movie scene is shot in Costa Rica. They picked up a lot of my friends for that cafe scene. Pretty cool to be involved like that in this sort of film. Spielberg would pick cinematographer Dean Cundey to be the director of photography for the film, which made a lot of sense in that Jurassic Park was very much a horror film, albeit maybe horror light.
Where does he think he's going?
A lot of experience with the horror genre as he directed films like Halloween, The Fog, and of course most notable, John Carpenter's The Thing. He also was no stranger to the world of groundbreaking visual effects, having worked on all 3 Back to the Future films, and even after Jurassic Park, he would work on films like Flubber, Casper, and Apollo 13, before later in his career filming things like Camp Rock, strangely enough. Quite the eclectic career. Cundey also quite notably had the trust of a lot of Hollywood directors, just based on his ability to light a scene that benefited visual effects work. He was really at the top of his game in that regard, down to even little details like in The Thing, adding a little photographer's trick of adding a glint of light to the human eye to get some depth, but leaving that glint out of the people that had become imposters essentially.
I enjoy drawing attention to something. You know, a lot of times there'll be just a little bit of light on the eyes, so that you are drawn to the eyes to look at them. So I think it's very much about creating the lighting that draws attention and, you know, tells the audience what they should be looking and feeling.
Which hyperfixation to specific lighting details was perfect for someone working in the early age of visual and digital effects. These slight details added a lot of complexity and depth to the films that he was a part of, and it was no different when it came to filming Jurassic Park, and Spielberg attests to this. Dean had great ideas about how to light the dinosaurs to make us think we were seeing more than we actually were. He lit Stan Winston's full-size animatronic creatures using edgier light to make them look larger and more ferocious.
You know, you try to visualize as much as possible in our case, the dinosaur shots, because there were a lot of people involved in making and creating and doing the puppeteering of dinosaurs, the CG work, the production design, and everybody. So the intention of the shot with a storyboard is good, but most of the time when you get there, you start with the storyboard, but it's up to your creative, instincts to actually make the shots work.
One aspect of Jurassic Park's production that you really can't overlook is the set designs, especially those that were constructed on-site in Hawaii.
A production designer is the person who's responsible for designing the world the movie takes place in, but it's kind of a magic trick because it really is involved with creating the suspension of disbelief. If you're watching with the idea that you're watching what we've done, then you're not in the movie. You could be admiring the movie, but you're not in the movie. You're not empathizing with the characters.
Interestingly enough, the film's production designer Rick Carter had a much more extensive role to play for the film. I was brought onto Jurassic Park about 2 years ago before we finally started shooting. On most shows, the production designer is brought in and handed a script and asked to visualize it. Not so on this one. I was in on many early meetings with Steven, where we would break down the scenes in the book and discuss which ones would work best for the film.
Each step that you got involved with was about constructing the actual journey as ride or amusement entertainment.
Because he was working on the film so early, he would find it easier to actually start scripting around certain set pieces and writing dialogue, almost as a way to visualize what was possible for Spielberg. After our last script meetings, I began collecting together my notes. I realized that the only way for me to see how the ideas might actually play out in the story was for me to collage them into Michael's latest script. Well, one thing led to another, and I found myself going through the entire story. That story would be resurrected in its entirety years later by Jurassic Time in the form of an audiobook. But even though many elements of Rick Carter's script would be cut out, there were many creative elements that would be used throughout the franchise in later films.
Rick Carter designed the movie, and the
job that he was faced with was creating a theme park built in Costa Rica. So the theme park had to kind of echo the local cultural design sensibilities of what we might adapt in an environment like that.
But what really stood out from his set designs in Hawaii was the concrete used throughout the structure design, giving an almost illusory-like feeling, a feeling that the animals behind the structures were controlled, that the people who built the park were in total control and nothing bad can happen. Architecturally, playing into this line from the film.
You never had control, that's the illusion! I was overwhelmed by the power of this place. But I made a mistake too. I didn't have enough respect for that power, and it's out now.
This is a civil emergency message. At 6:45 a.m., the National Weather Service has upgraded Hurricane Iniki to a Category 4 storm, now moving northwest at 17 miles per hour.
The Weather Service office in Honolulu forecasts that the eye of Iniki will pass just east of Kauai.
With sustained winds of 145 miles per hour and gusts exceeding 170. Residents on Kauai and surrounding islands are advised to seek shelter immediately.
3 weeks into a production that was about to wrap up, Spielberg was caught off guard by a real monster. Sue Kanaho, who was the executive director of the Kauai Visitor Bureau, would say, "The night before, I was on the Valley House set thanking Steven Spielberg for filming here, not knowing that he had not been told yet about the impending hurricane. So I thanked him for filming here and I said, 'Don't worry, you guys will be gone before the hurricane hits.' And he looked at me so strangely."
We turned up for work one morning and we were told, "We're not going to work today because there's a hurricane coming. Actually, it seems to be heading straight for us."
The storm that would ensue was one of the worst hurricanes on record for Hawaii, causing more than $3 billion in damages, estimated around $6 billion today. Some went without electricity for weeks, and many people lost their homes. And in the chaos, a lot of the sets ended up getting damaged or completely destroyed in the unrelenting winds.
And the hurricane lasted for 9 hours. I'll never forget when the eye of the storm passed directly over the hotel. We got out and looked up. It was beautiful blue sky above and just a wall of white clouds surrounding the hotel, slowly moving about like this. I'd never seen anything like it before. It was a special effect.
Producer Kathleen Kennedy recalled, "We started pulling all of our supplies into the ballroom, and the camera crew was quickly packing their things in the trucks. But if you're going to be stranded with anyone, be stranded with a movie crew. We had generators for lights and plenty of food and water. We were self-sustaining because we moved around on location all the time. The destruction of the airport was unbelievable," she recalled. "All the windows were blown out in the terminals and the buildings were full of palms, trees, sand, and water. Every single helicopter had been tipped on its side." Kathleen Kennedy would end up having to catch a ride on a Salvation Army plane to get to a location where she could coordinate a way to get the whole crew out. At the same time, coordinating to send over 20,000 pounds of supplies from Los Angeles and Honolulu to Kauai. Thankfully, they had wrapped up filming most of what they needed to before the storm and had captured some footage from the storm that they would utilize in the film as well. But although they had captured mostly everything, certain scenes had to be scrapped, specifically one that involved Samuel L. Jackson getting a longer and more drawn-out death rather than dying off-screen.
Oh, Mr. Arnold.
But now, production would swing towards the harder aspects of production, figuring out how to make the dinosaurs come to life. By September 15th, 1992, the production of Jurassic Park entered a new phase. The cast and crew had left behind the lush landscapes of Hawaii and relocated to California.
I think there's an energy that comes from being actually in the jungle. But there's no question with a movie like Jurassic Park, eventually you're going to have to be on stages. It's just impossible to have these huge pieces of equipment, and you need the infrastructure in place to keep them going.
Their new home base? Universal Studios in Los Angeles. It was here, in the controlled environment of studio backlots and cavernous sound stages, that some of the most iconic scenes in the film would come to life, using a careful balance of practical sets, animatronics, and meticulously crafted lighting. So let's take a look at how they used multiple sound stages to set up for each of these scenes. One of the first sets constructed at Universal was the massive industrial kitchen, which was set on stage 24. This was used for the unforgettable scene where the Raptors stalk Lex and Tim, but what made this sequence so intense on screen also made it incredibly difficult to shoot. The entire set was covered in reflective surfaces, stainless steel counters, glass panels, polished tile, which turned every light source into a potential problem.
Every surface in that kitchen was reflective. So it was a very meticulous process of putting lights to create the mood, and then putting up large black cloths to hide the reflection of the light.
It was a technical puzzle, but the result was one of the most suspenseful scenes in the entire film.
The shot I love the most is the shot where the dinosaur thinks it's Lex, which is a meal, climbing into a small compartment, and that the audience thinks that Lex is exposed to this attack. In fact, it's a reflection.
To bring the Raptors to life, though, in the kitchen scene, production pulled off some seriously impressive practical effects work. For the close-up moments, like when the Raptor peeks around the corner or breathes on the stainless steel, they used full-sized animatronic heads built by Stan Winston's team.
I didn't know anything about velociraptors until Michael Crichton introduced me to his velociraptors, and Michael did tons of research, as he always does for all of his projects. So he really wanted those velociraptors to be smart, like dolphins with claws and teeth and rending power, and he really created these awesome villains.
Yet the weirdest and one of the most convincing effects in the film was the man in a suit. It's difficult to believe that this creature walking into the kitchen actually is just a guy wearing a Raptor costume, a costume outfitted with controls for its facial expressions, and one that moves realistically thanks to intelligent construction. Stan Winston's studio was of course responsible for creating this Raptor, together with many other dinosaurs seen in the movie. Stan Winston had already made a name for himself with his groundbreaking work on films like The Terminator, Aliens, and Predator, and was known for his ability to blend practical effects with emerging technologies, creating creatures that felt truly lifelike. And for Jurassic Park, he and his team were responsible for creating the incredible animatronic dinosaurs. They built life-size models and animatronic heads that were used for many of the close-up shots, bringing a level of realism that was groundbreaking at the time.
I remember a conversation simply on the line of, would we be interested? And it was like, be interested, my goodness.
Every beginning in an artistic endeavor looks a little bit ugly and underwhelming, and this suit was no different. After initial proof of concept 5th scale figures, the team first conducted what they called a garbage bag test.
You're looking at right now is a mock-up or a really elaborate garbage bag test of Raptor, and I call it garbage bag test because it dates back to when we did Aliens. We actually constructed a queen alien full size out of garbage bag to prove that proof of concept.
Already this garbage bag test showed promise, with the movements of the Raptor's tail and head looking somewhat believable, but the realism was truly sold once the refined versions of the suit were constructed.
Here's some tests of it running. So it's very organic and it was very mobile.
Not with hydraulics or wire pulleys, but with smart mechanics. The Raptor's tail would wag from side to side, and the head would bop up and down, similar to a bird when moving.
And the idea was that the eyes and the jaw and the arms on it would end up being radio controlled. But here's the beginnings of getting that sort of bird-like head movement. Crash and Stan are joking around with, but what we were doing is trying to work out the range of movement. And Stan's doing other things. Always the joker.
Other features, such as the arms and facial gesticulation, would be controlled via radio, while the movements of the head itself are controlled with rods that have been built into the suit. A relatively low-tech but smart solution, making for a convincing Raptor.
Now, we have control over the jaw and the head moves. You can see it's come a long way since the very first tests. Here, it's very mobile. Now, these are the legs for the scene which was attached to the whole suit where I step in the doorway and it stands up and it starts hooting for the other raptor to come in the kitchen.
And a lot of this footage we're showing is from Stan Winston's YouTube channel, Stan Winston's School. And while Stan Winston sadly died in 2008, the people running this channel are still keeping his memory and his groundbreaking work alive. So definitely be sure to check out their work. Next up was stage 23, where they filmed the interior of the maintenance shed. You know, the place where Ellie has to go to flip the breakers and instead finds herself face to face with a raptor.
Hammond, I think we're back in business.
I will never forget when we did the scene in the basement when I turned the lights back on and this guy comes out at me and I turn and see him.
Compared to the kitchen and a lot of the other sets, the set was a bit more contained, but it still had its challenges. It had to look like a gritty, functional part of the park's infrastructure, full of cables, pipes, and shadows that could hide a dinosaur that could pop out at any second.
I was screaming for my life. And obviously, yes, you know, you're allowing your imagination to be stretched in terms of it being real, but it was very easy to be terrified.
It's a short sequence, but it does a lot of heavy lifting in terms of suspense. It's also one of those few moments where Spielberg really leans into the horror elements. Tight spaces, sudden reveals, and just enough time for the audience to realize what's coming before it's too late. Production would then move to Red Rock Canyon State Park in California, which was used as a stand-in for the Montana Badlands. Originally, the filmmakers intended to shoot on location in Montana, but those plans were abandoned due to time and budget constraints. To ensure the dig site appeared scientifically plausible, renowned paleontologist Jack Horner, who served as the film's technical advisor, was consulted during production.
Well, the first person we went to was Jack Horner, not just to achieve an authenticity, but we wanted a credible resource that could back up several theories that we were sort of expounding. And one was that dinosaurs eventually evolved into birds.
And even the word raptor means bird of prey.
And that's something that Jack Horner believes in and could defend if necessary. And Jack Horner became our credibility.
Though, despite his involvement, some in the scientific community later criticized the scene for oversimplifying paleontological work. Nonetheless, the sequence effectively introduced key characters and set the tone for the film's grounded approach to its science fiction premise. Stage 27 was where they built the massive jungle set, including that giant tree Grant has to climb to rescue Tim after the T-Rex pushes their tour vehicle off the road.
When you're working with a big studio like Universal, it takes them quite a while to build those jungles, to build the interior of the compound, a lot of the things. So when they're under construction, you sort of wander and look to see what it's going to look like, and sometimes you have the luxury of saying, well, I just went down to the stage. Would it be possible to put a window over here? We can get some light to come through, so the prep is very important with a big studio production.
The crazy part, they had to shoot the car falling through the branches multiple times, so they designed the tree with 3 separate faces, each decorated to look like a different part of the fall. That way, they could reuse the same structure and still make it feel like the car was falling farther than it actually was. And when they were done with that, they would just redress it to use it again in the scene where Grant, Lex, and Tim wake up to a Brachiosaurus munching on some treetops. It's a super clever piece of set design. Stage 28 was home to 2 pretty important sets, the park's control room and the genetics lab. Basically all the scenes where we see people monitoring the park, watching the tour, or messing around with the dinosaur DNA. Those were shot here. And while the sets weren't as flashy as the big action sequences, they were crucial for selling the science behind the park. The clean, high-tech look, at the time, helped ground the movie in a sort of believable reality, even playing into that idea that technology would help them control the creatures. This wrapped up a lot of the, you could say, easier studio work for the film. Of course, the final part that was missing from all of this was making the T-Rex come to life. And for that, they would need a much bigger studio.
So we opted to build big jungles on the stages at Universal so that we could do rain, nighttime, and not have to worry about all of the stuff that happens working in a natural environment.
The T-Rex breakout scene was so massive, Universal didn't even have a soundstage big enough to shoot it. So the crew had to move the entire production over to Stage 16 at Warner Brothers, which, conveniently, is one of the biggest sound stages in the world.
This soundstage has 32,000 square feet of production area. It's 6 stories up and another 3 stories below where I'm standing, making it a total of about 98 feet tall inside.
It was great being on the stages because they were recreating through our set design beautiful sections of jungle, and it actually marries quite well into what we shot in Hawaii.
And since the scene takes place during a thunderstorm, the stage was outfitted with rain machines, water rigs, mud, and lightning effects. It turned into one of the most elaborate and technical setups of the entire film. And beyond the technical problems from a set design perspective, this is really where a lot of the prep work earlier had helped, especially with testing out ideas like stop motion and visual effects before. It didn't make the shoot any easier, but it helped that they came prepared to capture what they needed to. So, how did they get prepared for this incredibly technical scene? Back during pre-production, Spielberg knew that Jurassic Park was going to become an experimental and boundary-breaking movie, one filled with interesting techniques and workflows that we're still used to this day. When it comes to the impressive dinosaur CGI, however, there is a long journey we have to explore before we get to that point. With computer-generated imagery for the film having been in its infancy back in the day, there weren't many avenues to depict beings such as dinosaurs in a realistic manner, especially when it pertained to showing them in a one-to-one scale. For the most part, it just came down to building big animatronic dinosaur suits, and sometimes only hinting to the fact that a dinosaur is in the environment.
The first time I saw the T-Rex was at Stan Winston's shop. My kid would say, "Where does the poo-poo come from, Daddy?" I had a chance to actually operate it myself, which was a thrill. Where the movements were so smooth and so authentic. You know, when it would snap its head around, it didn't have a recoil. The head would go as fast as you can imagine and would come to a complete stop and look right at you. Its eyes would stereo focus right on you. That was absolutely frightening to watch.
There was this problem that needed solving, which was wanting to show these animals in their full glory, running, jumping, and roaring at each other. Luckily, there was a form of animation that could be made use of for solving this exact issue. Phil Tippett, a stop-motion artist, got into the profession by making home movies, eventually getting the idea to found a studio that focused on prop making, miniatures, and stop-motion animation. A film that would become a great showpiece to Spielberg in the early 90s was his short film Prehistoric Beast, a story that follows a triceratops through its day, and that predates not only the movie Jurassic Park, but also the novel. From a production standpoint, the short was ambitious, including detailed miniatures and beautiful sets, creating breathtaking, albeit creepy dioramas of a prehistoric life we can only imagine. One that puts horror and suspense into the forefront, to a point where it might be just a little too scary to broadcast on children's TV. Soon enough, with the release of Jurassic Park's novel, it would become clear that dinosaurs would remain popular beasts in pop culture. In Phil's professional career, he would soon work on independent films that you probably have heard of, creating masks and props for a certain George Lucas, who later down the line would suggest Tippett as the man for Jurassic stop-motion action.
So when Jurassic was mounting, Spielberg talked to George, and George said, "You should talk, Phil's your guy, he's a dinosaur guy."
Chuck was always going to be the old-fashioned way through stop-motion animation. The same way that Willis O'Brien made King Kong, just taking that little armature on a small maquette and just moving it just a millimeter at a time. And Phil Tippett was hired by me to do that because he was the best in the business.
Unlike what many might believe, stop motion in its many different forms is still used for certain works up to this day. And for productions at the time, it was still the best method of achieving certain shots. Think RoboCop, the robot falling down the stairs or the prototype killing itself, or the Terminator endoskeleton chase, or fantastical fights against undead dangers in Jason and the Argonauts. The idea was to, in part, follow that same approach for Jurassic Park, although there of course are some limitations to consider. For one, stop motion is inherently jerky, and that jerkiness needed to be addressed somehow. For that, the animation's frame rate can be increased to smooth out the motion. However, what also contributes to the jumpy nature of the stop motion animation is the lack of motion blur, as every photograph taken is a motionless object. The resulting movie, when stitched together, has no motion blur. Animators had some tricks up their sleeves for exactly this issue. For instance, using petroleum jelly like Vaseline to smear the lens, motion blur can be effectively faked. Another method was to tap the model slightly while taking a photo. The object physically moves during the exposure, resulting in the desired blur. Both of these approaches may have been too much to ask for though, with the high frame rate animation employed, nudging the models to induce movements during individual photo exposures runs a high risk of knocking the model out of position, introducing an even more disjointed look than we had previously. And this is where ILM enters the picture, who had an interesting tool named Morph. It was used for the Terminator 2 T-1000 scene during which the robot melts through a gate. It employed interpolation, something that we just take for granted nowadays in our workflows. Essentially, it generates an image between animated keyframes to smooth out a movement, and it would not have been impossible to use it on these miniature dinosaurs to smooth out the movement and fake motion blur. Phil Tippett himself even developed a technique called Go Motion with ILM. Originally pioneered for The Empire Strikes Back, Go Motion allowed for models like the Tauntauns to appear more fluid and realistic on screen. When filming began, the model would be moved during the camera's exposure, creating natural motion blur, something traditional stop motion lacked. This gave creatures a more lifelike sense of movement, especially in films like Dragon Slayer. This is what they originally thought would be used for Jurassic Park, but in fact, it was just a stepping stone to something much bigger. Eventually, it came down to animation tests to decide the fate of stop motion in Jurassic Park. Tippett's T-Rex animatic was highly detailed and incredibly convincing. However, Spielberg was soon going to notice what advantages digital animation could bring to the table.
We all started to plan it out as the conventional stop motion, go motion, rod puppet, high speed with a little bit of computer graphics.
And then one day I got a call from Dennis Muren at ILM, who already had the job of doing Jurassic Park with Phil Tippett. And Dennis said that he thought that he could pull off a full-size dinosaur that would be authentic to the eye. And so he started doing tests. And the first tests he did was a whole herd of Gallimimus, just the skeletal structure of the Gallimimus, running through a still photograph of Hawaii.
It became more and more obvious that digital characters aren't just going to be a curiosity, but an essential component of the movie, one that was rife with challenges that ILM had not faced before. For one, the CG needed for this movie ought to be as realistic as possible, which was new for ILM, as they had relied heavily on stylization in the past for the most part. Everything ranging from how the dinosaurs look to how they move in a scene had to look and feel real.
So the computer had a design that would configure and wouldn't vary. I didn't want people to say, oh, that's a CGI shot. But I wanted to bridge every single technology so the film would simply be, that's a dinosaur, as Grant does when he looks back and he says,
it's a dinosaur.
To get there was a lot of work to get done, especially a lot of trial and error and convincing Spielberg that CG animation was the viable and realistic route for this film. Tests needed to be conducted, which led to a variety of sequences which would soon greatly impress the director. ILM started simple, first animating only skeletons of bipedal dinosaurs running around on fields. Already their motion looked convincing, even though the footage that only included skeletal representations of the dinosaur herd. It proved what it set out to prove. The motion was incredibly smooth. What surprised Spielberg the most, however, is the T-Rex test that went toe-to-toe with Tippett's detailed animation.
A videotape came from ILM, and we saw this image of what they had done, and we're just, wow, everything changed.
And this technology really kind of, changed my movie forever. And I think in that sense, changed the world forever.
The T-Rex ran smoothly, was textured realistically, and fit into the scenery quite well. That was the moment where the idea for stop motion for Jurassic Park died, something that Tippett did not take lightly.
It was
April 20th, 1992. I remember we called it Black Monday because we got the word that production was going digital. It's like suddenly, here we are, we're extinct, we're the dinosaurs. And of course, that irony wasn't lost on any of us.
Tippett was not made redundant, however, as Jurassic Park ended up being stop-motion animated after all. Well, kind of.
I was just emotional about it and not thinking. But Steven knew I knew stuff. And the computer graphics guys didn't. They weren't filmmakers. They knew how to make stuff work in the computer, but they didn't see like the big picture of like all the things you have to do from pre-production, production, and post, so that everything's going to work when you get it back. And just they had never been exposed to that kind of stuff.
While the engineers from ILM had a high degree of technical sophistication and were able to create tools which were on the bleeding edge in the realms of 3D rendering and animation, they weren't quite as knowledgeable as a stop-motion animator when it came to posing and animating a digital model. So luckily, Phil didn't lose his job. He was able to lend his hand in physically animating digital characters, which was done using a bizarre but equally beautiful input device. Equipped with dozens of sensors, those custom-built armatures would be what posed and recorded keyframes for the digital model, essentially acting as an input device for the animation program.
Development of this particular piece of hardware, which we nicknamed the dinosaur input device. We take a puppet that's very similar to what they're used to animating and electronically encode it so that they can move this around and have that be applied to a computer.
That solution, however, was perfect for the artists on the team that were not able to interface with the programs using limited hardware. With this solution, Tippett and his colleagues would transfer their stop-motion skills into the digital world without compromise. Now that the artists were armed with the right tools for the trade, they still needed to get the movements of the animals down as realistically as possible as well. Normally, that would involve just going on long trips to zoos and wildlife resorts and just looking at a variety of animals and their behavior. But with the animals in Jurassic Park, they've been extinct for around, 65 million years. So what now? This is where analogs and some artistic trial and error came in. One technique artists across the board like to utilize is essentially acting out the movements and emotions of a character themselves, which is something that animators have done forever. This was used effectively for multiple scenes involving bipedal creatures, with the artists lining up the ILM parking lot and running around like dinosaurs.
So another interesting thing that we did is, because we wanted to make sure that we really had our heads in the right place, that we were dinosaurs, we used to go outdoors and run around pretending we were gallimimuses or T-Rexes, hunting each other and shoot film. Also to give us an idea of how an animal in motion would look, at least if we were that animal.
While observing behind the scenes, this process may seem a little funny. It really paid dividends, and Phil Tippett himself was a big advocate for acting out the movements you're about to animate.
One of my big things is to try and get the animators to pantomime with their body. So we had instituted these mind classes.
Another thing that can be done is figuring out dinosaur locomotion on the go. The T-Rex run cycle, as an example, was quite the challenge for the team, as different paleontologists would disagree with each other as to how a dinosaur would look on the run. With competing expert opinions and multiple scenes to finish, there was only one way to get the sequence done: by just animating it on the go and fixing what was wrong along the way.
There's no reference for a 7-ton bipedal animal that can move 30 miles an hour.
We met with 3 paleontologists and they didn't even agree amongst themselves.
To do this, the animation would be played on a loop in reverse, which made it easier to spot problems in the run cycle. Eventually, the animation got the researchers' approval upon review. The movement finally looked convincing. Yet another issue when it came to realizing Jurassic Park was getting the running sequences right. A lot of the 50 VFX shots in the movie have been filmed with static plates, meaning that the camera was planted on a tripod somewhere on set and left alone to easily insert digital characters. But what can one do if a scene is supposed to be more dynamic? This was a serious issue, as the movie wouldn't feel very realistic at all if hectic CG shots couldn't be properly solved. Thankfully, ILM had a solution to this problem as well.
I kept saying, I want to move the camera. Don't tell me that every time a CGI dinosaur comes plodding through the scene, I got to lock down my camera. I want to dolly and pan and be normal. I even want a handhold.
What is common practice today, at first needed to be figured out. With placing little balls all throughout the scene, the ground could be effectively tracked in software.
And Dennis was able to do that. We raced along with Grant and Lex and Timmy running, looking at nothing, and that was bouncing all around the place with a bunch of references that Dennis put into the ground, little Day-Glo golf balls.
Aside from this scene, many more challenges lied ahead. One of the biggest challenges in the movie, where multiple paradigms would be combined into a whole, was the sequence where a T-Rex would do what it does best: terrorize the visitors turned survivalists in animatronic form and digitally. This required a life-size animatronic with realistic-looking skin and a 3D model good enough to not notice it when a scene switched from the animatronic to it, a soundstage, and tons of water, which for the practical side of things posed multiple challenges.
Unfortunately, I didn't know you couldn't pour water on the dinosaurs, so I suddenly decided to do the entire main road attack in rain. And Stan did his funny clearing of his throat. You know, I didn't exactly design these things for water. And I said, well, Stan, what happens if we get them wet? He said, nobody knows. And I don't want to find out.
Another issue is water weight, which is a more unexpected consequence of the T-Rex's artificial skin. Over time, water would get trapped in the skin of the dinosaur, which would cause the animatronic to gain weight and malfunction.
So then the T-Rex weighed a lot more than what it was originally built for, and all the tolerances were now off.
I knew something was wrong with the T-Rex when the T-Rex was suddenly actually shaking the way you shake when you're cold. And the T-Rex would actually just sit there and vibrate like that. And suddenly all of Stan's kids would run in with big chamois.
This massive animatronic was yet another piece of technology which replaced the tried and tested stop motion ways of doing things. Yet it also proved that technological advancements weren't here to replace talent.
Originally, everyone had this scare that the computer technology would put everyone out of work. They're going to sit, directors will sit at a keyboard and punch one button that says D for dinosaur and another button that says C for creature. And in Jurassic, we learned that it created a lot of work for us.
Every movement and effect on the soundstage was controlled by people on set, and every digital scene that was interspliced naturally was created by a variety of artists too, creating an interplay between the practical and digital without costing the artists their jobs. On the digital front, the process looked quite similar to how crews shot VFX plates for the past weeks on location, shooting a sequence that had non-existent dinosaurs in mind, and even lighting it in a way that the artists wouldn't have to worry about later. For the T-Rex stomping around on a car, we can already observe how intricate some composites truly were. As usual, everything starts with an empty background plate where nothing is going on to ground the entire scene. Then the Tyrannosaurus comes in manipulating a recreated CG car, which progressively gets destroyed bit by bit. To get the trapped actors to crawl out of the car, the motions are recorded against a blue screen and subsequently were inserted into the CG car. Even though the scene was created in the early days of photorealistic VFX compositing, it's still rather convincing to this day, especially as the dark scenery and genius lighting kind of obfuscates the fact that what we are looking at are 3D graphics. One of the most iconic shots in the whole movie, the glass of water rippling as the T-Rex approaches, wasn't in the original plan. Spielberg came up with it after feeling bass vibrations while listening to Earth, Wind, and Fire in his car. He wanted that same sense of tension on screen. But the problem was, no one had a clue how to do it. It wasn't until the night before shooting that effects supervisor, Michael Lantieri, discovered that if you put a glass of water on a guitar and pluck the strings, you get those perfect concentric ripples. The next day, they rigged up guitar strings under the dashboard of the car and had a guy lying on the floor plucking them, in sync with the T-Rex's footsteps. Low tech, but incredibly effective. One funny detail that got questioned on set was, where does the cliff come from? The T-Rex steps out of its paddock, and suddenly there is this huge drop, the car falls down. Screenwriter David Koepp actually asked Spielberg about it, and Spielberg just pointed at the giant animatronic dinosaur and said, "There's a T-Rex. They're not going to notice anything else." And honestly, he was right. At least at the time. The initial ending for Jurassic Park involved Dr. Grant using a mechanical platform to push a velociraptor into the jaws of a Tyrannosaurus fossil. However, after filming the T-Rex breakout sequence, Steven Spielberg realized that the dinosaur had become the film's central attraction.
That's something that we couldn't have done or even known we could have done 2 months earlier. Steven had been seeing the work we've been doing, and he got to thinking, I guess, that we needed a bigger ending for the film, which was great. It's the right idea, and here was the technology to do it.
The result was a finale that remains one of the most memorable sequences in modern cinema, and one that was never part of the original script. Filming would wrap on November 30th, 1992, under budget and 12 days ahead of schedule. It would head on to post-production, and of course ILM would take over with some of the groundbreaking CGI and digital VFX work that we talked about. For the score, Spielberg recruited none other than John Williams. I mean, I don't know who else Spielberg would have picked at the time. It took him a month to compose and a further month to record, a process lasting between February to April 1993. And it, of course, resulted in one of the most memorable scores of Williams' career. Jurassic Park would go on to be released a massive success and kickstarted a franchise that would still continue over 30 years later. But I think what's so compelling about productions like this, beyond the big names and the giant set pieces, are all of these little stories along the way, the small and often overlooked moments that make the whole thing possible. You've got the person who sparked the idea, the writers and artists who developed it, the crew who built the sets, rigged the lights, moved the animatronics, or plucked guitar strings under a dashboard to just ripple a glass of water. Every single one of them helped to shape that final product. And yeah, Spielberg gets a lot of the credit, and sure, he deserves it. But even he would tell you that a film like Jurassic Park doesn't exist without a massive team of people, each bringing their own ideas, their own energy, and their own creativity to the table. It takes all of them working together to make something that lasts. And that really is the real magic of filmmaking.